Everyone laughed when he touched the forbidden piano, but when his fingers hit the keys, the crowd froze before the impossible. Tiago Reis didn't speak, not because he was shy. He simply saw no point in wasting words when nobody really listened. He survived in the depths of Parisopolis, São Paulo, in a cramped apartment where the walls were as thin as paper and the neighbors were loud as if the world would end tomorrow. His mother, Vittoria, worked 3 different jobs just to keep the rent paid. His older brother, Lucas, was trapped in a vicious circle of bad company that Tiago would never trust. But Tiago had his salvation: music. He didn't own a refined piano or a modern studio, just a broken keyboard at the community center down the street. Half the keys were dead, and the chord released dangerous sparks if moved. To anyone else, it would be trash. To Tiago, it was the entire universe. Every afternoon after school, he would rush there with fingers tingling with anticipation. No sheet music, no formal lessons, just sounds he carried in his blood and soul. He played what he felt. Sometimes joy, sometimes anger, sometimes silence itself transformed into melody. Nobody had taught him, but some abilities need no teachers. They simply exist, waiting to be discovered, like rough diamonds in the mud. At school, Tiago kept himself invisible. He didn't cause problems, but he didn't stand out either. Teachers never noticed how his fingers tapped complex rhythms during math classes, or how his eyes lit up when the national anthem played on Monday mornings. Most classmates didn't even notice his existence, except when they needed to copy answers or when they were looking for an easy target for humiliation. His only breath of hope came from Professor Aurora Lins, who taught music at Paulo Freire Municipal School. She was the only adult who seemed to see beyond his silence. She caught him humming during breaks, called him after class, and asked questions that forced him to think about chords, scales, and how to tell stories with his hands instead of his mouth. "You hear the world differently than most people, Tiago," she said once, after he improvised a lullaby during an exercise. Never let that die. He didn't plan to allow it. Then, on a rainy Thursday before the July break, the school announced a joint event with São Paulo Elite College, a luxurious private institution on the other side of the city. It was presented as an artistic cultural exchange, which meant that Tiago's class would spend an entire day attending workshops and student performances at the other school. Most classmates groaned with boredom. Tiago sat up straight as a statue. São Paulo Elite College. He had heard about it. Verdant fields, imported uniforms, a cafeteria that served gourmet food. They said its music department had a professional grand piano in every room. Tiago couldn't even imagine that. He had never touched a real piano. He saw one once at São Paulo Hall, when his class received free tickets to the symphony orchestra. The instrument gleamed under the stage lights, like something out of an impossible dream. He didn't even hear most of that concert. He was too hypnotized watching the pianist's hands dance over the keys. Now he would have a chance to see it up close, maybe even play it if no one was looking. Vittoria ironed her son's only dress shirt the night before the excursion, even though it had a small tear on the sleeve. "You behave," she ordered, without taking her eyes off the iron. "Don't make me feel embarrassed in front of those people." "I won't. Don't touch anything that isn't yours." He nodded, and he really intended to comply. But music had a peculiar way of making him forget all the rules. Tiago had no idea how a single moment of courage, or perhaps madness, was about to transform his life forever. The bus trip to Elite College lasted only 40 minutes, but for Tiago, it was like crossing a portal to another dimension. When the bus passed through the Golden Gates, he pressed his face against the window, admiring the impeccably trimmed gardens, fountains that actually worked, and buildings that looked more like museums than classrooms. Teenagers wearing navy blue blazers formed groups, laughing in that typical manner of those who never had to worry if there would be dinner on the table. Everything seemed too clean, too quiet. Even the sidewalks looked expensive. Tiago followed his classmates off the bus, clutching the strap of his worn backpack. He didn't say anything, just absorbed the sight of a courtyard with a bronze statue in the center, some founder holding a scroll, with an arrogant smile carved into his face. Inside the main building, the floor shone like a mirror. The corridors smelled of expensive cleaning products and new paper. No graffiti, no broken tiles, no shouting teachers, just silence. Privilege. He walked with the group past showcases of student art, framed as if they belonged in a professional gallery. One piece even had a price tag, 3,500 reais. Tiago stared in disbelief. He knew how to draw, but nobody would ever pay for his sketches. They were led to an auditorium where elite students were already seated in perfect rows. A gray-haired man welcomed them with that voice people use at expensive funerals. He said some things about unity and creative expression, calling the event a celebration of talents from all social backgrounds. Tiago looked around and counted. Of all those present in the room, he was one of only 7 black students. Most of the elite students looked like they had never heard no, never been told to wait until next month to buy school supplies. They watched a brief performance by the elite jazz ensemble. It was good, clean, technical, even impressive, but something about that sound seemed too rehearsed in a way that made Tiago's chest tighten. Not because he wasn't good enough, he knew he was, but because no one there would believe it unless he proved it. The groups were divided into workshops. Tiago was assigned to a composition workshop in room 208. He walked there with a group of students he didn't know, keeping silent while others made jokes about cafeteria food and whose parents had imported cars. Room 208 was a music room, yes, but nothing like the one at his school. This one had floor-to-ceiling windows, soundproof walls, and instruments lined up like soldiers, guitars, violins, a cello in the corner. But what captured Tiago's gaze was the piano, a gleaming Steinway grand, larger than any instrument he had ever touched. The lid was open, the keys polished, like pure ivory. The instructor hadn't arrived yet, and most students sat down without showing much interest. Tiago didn't. He remained leaning against the wall, eyes fixed on the piano, as if the instrument was challenging him. Then he heard a voice behind him. "Don't even think about it." He turned around. A tall boy with perfectly combed blonde hair was staring at him, flanked by 2 others who seemed to practice scowling in the mirror every morning. The blonde was wearing a personalized blazer, the initials GVA embroidered on the chest. "It was my father's donation," the boy added arrogantly. "Do you have anything like that in your neighborhood?" Tiago blinked, unsure if the boy was being serious or just trying to provoke him. "I wasn't going to break it." "Are you sure?" The boy smiled with disdain. "Careful. Those keys weren't made for dirty fingers." The words hit like a slap. The room grew quieter. Some students turned to watch. Tiago felt heat rise to his ears, but he didn't move. His hands remained at his sides. The piano seemed more distant now, as if it had shifted to another dimension. Part of him wanted to leave. Another part wanted to speak. But he didn't trust that his voice would come out steady. Then someone behind him laughed, and that was the trigger for something inside Tiago to break and reconstruct itself in seconds. Tiago doesn't remember making the decision. In one instant, he was standing still, with hot cheeks and racing heart. In the next, he was walking toward the piano. The smug smile on the blonde boy's face faltered slightly. His friends exchanged glances, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Tiago didn't hesitate. He pulled the bench out with both hands and sat down slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. His palms were damp, his throat dry, but his fingers didn't tremble. The room was motionless, not silent, but static, like a breath held too long. The instructor still hadn't arrived. Perhaps that was a blessing. Perhaps it was fate. Tiago raised his hands over the keys. Then he hesitated for a second, because this wasn't the broken keyboard from the community center. It was real. It was weight. It was a sound that carried and echoed and filled a room, not because of volume, but because of presence. He could feel all eyes on his back. He could hear Gabriel's voice echoing in his head. Dirty fingers, as if his skin had somehow stained the air. He took another breath and pressed the first key. A simple C minor, soft and clean. It sounded as if it had been waiting for him for years. Then came an E, then G. He built the chord the way he always did, by instinct. Nobody told him how, and nobody needed to. Music was the only thing that always made sense, without needing explanations. He let his left hand follow, walking bass notes, gentle at first, then stronger. Then the right hand returned, weaving a melody over the rhythm. Something familiar, but unfinished. It was the melody he always played when he was alone, the one he never named, because it seemed too personal, a song that didn't need words to say what he couldn't. The room began to change. Conversations ceased. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward. The two boys who were behind Gabriel no longer seemed amused. They looked confused. Gabriel didn't speak, but his mouth tightened. And Tiago, he didn't even notice anymore. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for the nights. He spent alone in his room, listening to the sounds of the city through the broken window. He was playing for the Sundays when his mother swayed to gospel music at church, eyes closed, face softened for the first time that week. He was playing for that version of himself that had never heard "Don't touch that." The music grew. His hands flew faster now, confident and precise. It wasn't perfect. He missed a note, stumbled on a chord, but it didn't matter. It was raw, alive, the kind of performance that didn't ask permission. When he stopped, the room didn't react immediately. There was a pause, the kind that usually follows a punch to the stomach. Then a girl near the door released a soft, "My God." Another student applauded. Several others joined in. Gabriel didn't move. His hands were clenched at his sides. "Not bad," one of his friends muttered, but Tiago heard something more in his voice. It was respect. The door opened. The instructor finally entered, holding a clipboard. He stopped mid-step, looking from Tiago to the stunned class. "Did I miss something?" he asked. A boy near the front nodded slowly. "Yes, you missed everything." Tiago rose slowly, pushing the bench back into place. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, for once. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was earned. But just when Tiago thought it was all over, he turned and found something waiting for him in the hallway that he could never have predicted. Tiago stepped into the hallway, his chest still tight from the adrenaline, unsure whether he should feel proud or terrified. He hadn't planned to play. He didn't even know if he could. But he did. And now everything felt different. That's when he saw them. A small crowd had gathered outside the music room. Students from other workshops, some teachers, all drawn by the sound. Some looked curious, others surprised, some even impressed, but the face that Tiago immediately focused on was Professor Aurora's. She was near the entrance, her hand covering her mouth, not in shock, but in something deeper. Her eyes shone in a way that made Tiago look away for a second. She walked toward him slowly. "You really played that?" she asked softly. He nodded. "That was yours? That music?" He nodded again, almost afraid to admit it out loud. She looked beyond him, into the room, then back at him. "Tiago, that wasn't just good. That was something people will remember forever." He didn't know what to say. He had never thought about being remembered. He just wanted to touch the keys, hear how they sounded when played without fear. Another teacher approached, someone he didn't recognize, a tall woman in a gray blazer, with a clipboard under her arm. She bent slightly to meet him at eye level. "I'm Dr. Santoro," she said. "I coordinate the advanced music program here." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't seem to mind. "Have you ever had formal lessons?" He shook his head. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "Just practicing," he said. "I play at the community center sometimes, and at home when my brother lends me his headphones." She smiled. "Well, you have something special. That kind of ear, that kind of expression. You don't teach that. You guide it, you nurture it." Behind her, Gabriel finally emerged from the classroom. His blazer was now wrinkled from leaning against the wall too long. He scanned the crowd, then focused on Tiago. Their eyes met, but neither said a word. One of Gabriel's friends whispered something and laughed, but Gabriel didn't respond. His face was difficult to read now, not angry, not arrogant, just uncertain. Professor Aurora intervened. "Tiago, how would you feel about playing something at the final presentation this afternoon?" He looked up quickly. "Me?" "Yes. They always leave space for a guest student to share something at the closing. I think, no, I know, it should be you." He looked at the floor, then at Dr. Santoro, then back at Professor Aurora. A wave of nervousness hit him like a second blow. Performing once in a classroom was one thing. Playing in front of the entire auditorium, "I don't know," he muttered. "You don't have to," Professor Aurora said gently, "but I think you'll regret it if you don't." He knew she was right. He nodded slowly. "Okay." The teachers began to disperse the hallway, and the moment folded back into the day. Tiago followed Professor Aurora as she guided him toward the performance hall, his steps slow, the corridor impossibly long. But something inside him was different now. It wasn't confidence, not exactly. It was something closer to certainty, like when a song plays and you already know where the notes will go, even if you've never heard it before. Gabriel stayed behind, alone, near the door. "Tiago," he said quietly. Tiago turned. Gabriel seemed to want to say something, perhaps take back what he said earlier, perhaps pretend nothing happened, but instead, he just gave a small nod and walked away. But when Tiago entered the auditorium later that day, he had no idea who else would be watching from the shadows and how deeply his performance would echo beyond that room. The auditorium was brighter than Tiago remembered. He stood behind the curtain, heart racing, staring at the polished stage floor. Rows of chairs stretched beyond the stage, already half filled. Students entered with snacks and programs, joking and browsing on their phones. Some teachers stood near the back, conversing in low voices. Everything seemed casual, except to Tiago. He was wearing the same wrinkled shirt from that morning, sweat beginning to darken the collar. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear of playing. He trusted his hands. It was the crowd, the unfamiliar eyes, the weight of being seen. Professor Aurora appeared beside him, her voice low. They're going to love you. What if I mess up? He asked. You won't. And even if you do, they'll still feel it. That helped a little. The presenter, a tall girl with thick glasses and a polished voice, introduced the closing performance. We'd like to welcome a guest student from Paulo Freire Municipal School, Tiago Reis, with an original piano piece. Polite applause. Tiago stepped out. He didn't look at the audience, just focused on the piano, waiting at center stage. It gleamed under the lights, the same as before, as if it knew him now. He sat, took a deep breath, let his fingers find their home, and played. It wasn't the same melody as before. This one was slower, quieter, more patient, like a letter written aloud. It began with a kind of pain that cannot be named, something in the pauses between notes, in the way certain chords hung longer than they should. Then it changed, became warmer, braver, like something fighting to stand on its own feet. Each measure told a piece of him. The nights alone in his room, the sound of his mother praying in the kitchen when she thought he was asleep, the way the community center keyboard sometimes sparked but never stopped working. The room grew still. Even the teachers stopped whispering. Phones were lowered, eyes were raised, and somewhere in the second half, the emotion behind his notes caught up with him. His chest tightened, his eyes stung, but his hands didn't falter. He played to the end. When the last note faded, he raised his hands slowly, as if releasing something heavy. Silence, then a single clap, then another. Then the entire room. A true miracle didn't happen. No, this wasn't a movie. But the applause was real, complete. Some students stood up. One teacher wiped her eyes. Even the presenter seemed surprised. Tiago stood up, bowed without thinking, and quickly left the stage before the crowd could reach him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Then a voice. That was incredible. He turned. Gabriel. His blazer was buttoned now, hair a little neater, but the arrogance was gone. He wasn't with his friends this time. I didn't know you could do all that, he said. Tiago said nothing. What I said before, I crossed the line. Tiago remained silent. I guess I just didn't expect. Tiago looked at him, then said quietly, You didn't need to expect. Gabriel nodded once. Yeah, and that was it. No big moment, no handshake, just an awkward pause, and two boys standing in a hallway too big for either of them. Professor Aurora came out smiling. You did it. He managed a breathless laugh. I think I did. She looked at him for a long second. Let's talk later. There's someone I want you to meet. What Tiago didn't know was that someone in the audience had already made a call, one that would open a door he never imagined he could walk through. When the bus returned to the parking lot of Paulo Freire Municipal School, the sky was streaked with gold. Tiago sat near the window, his forehead resting against the glass, watching São Paulo pass in fragments. Fast food signs, gas stations, corner stores. Familiar again, comfortable, but smaller now. He hadn't said much during the journey. Some classmates gave him high fives. Others asked how he learned to play like that. One boy, Julian, even joked, Dude, you made the rich kids clap. That's magic. Tiago had smiled, but inside, everything was still vibrating. It wasn't nerves. It wasn't fear. It was something else he didn't yet have words to define. Professor Aurora waited at the last step as students got off the bus. Tiago, she said, gently pulling him aside. That woman I introduced you to, Dr. Santoro, she wants to see you again. He blinked. Why? She coordinates a summer arts program based on scholarships. She said, it's rare to find someone like you who hasn't been formally trained. He looked at his sneakers, the left one worn at the tip. I don't have money for lessons. That's the point, Professor Aurora said. You wouldn't need any. Everything would be covered. You just have to show up and play. Tiago didn't know what to say. Opportunities like this didn't come to boys like him, not without some hidden price. I told her I would talk to your mother, she added. She'll want to know. That night at home, Vittoria stood in the kitchen, holding the brochure in one hand and a half-burned cheese sandwich in the other. Her face didn't say much, but her silence was deafening. They're not trying to exploit my son for anything, are they? She finally asked. No, ma'am, Professor Aurora answered from across the table. It's a real opportunity. They've done this for students all over the state. Vittoria looked at the paper again. And he would stay where? In dormitories, supervised, Baton Rouge School for the Arts. Just a few weeks. He would be home by the end of summer. Tiago sat on the edge of the sofa, still with his backpack, fingers curled around the straps. His mother looked at him, unblinking. Do you want this? He met her eyes. I think so. She sighed deeply, the kind of sigh she only made when her mind was traveling far ahead of her mouth. He's 12 years old, she said quietly. Still a baby. I'll be careful, Tiago said, his voice just above a whisper. You better. She looked at Professor Aurora again. I'll think about it. That was already more than enough for now. A week later, the letter arrived. A white envelope with blue trim. His name perfectly typed in the center. Inside was the formal offer. Tiago read it 3 times before handing it to his mother. She didn't say anything at first, just nodded, and then returned it without a word. He packed his things in a bag that was too big for him. Professor Aurora drove him to the campus herself. On the way, she told him about other young people who had gone through the program, some who had never even touched a real instrument before their first lesson, others who went on to places like Juilliard and Berkeley. But none of them sounded like you, she said, and I mean that sincerely. The campus wasn't like elite São Paulo. It wasn't shiny, it wasn't luxurious, but it felt honest. The music building had paint chips on the windowsill and benches worn smooth by years of waiting. Tiago liked that. On his first day, he played for 3 instructors. They didn't ask where he came from. They asked in which key he felt most at home. He said, D minor. They nodded as if they understood. By the end of the first week, he had written 3 new pieces. By the end of the second, he was teaching a classmate how to move through changes with feeling instead of mathematics. One evening, after dinner, his instructor sat beside him in the practice room. Do you know what I told my husband after I heard you play? She asked. Tiago shook his head. That's what talent looks like when it's unafraid. But even with new keys in his hands and doors opening, Tiago still had one thing to do before any of it felt real. It was October when Tiago walked back through the doors of São Paulo Elite College. This time, he didn't arrive on a school bus. No matching t-shirts, no excursion form in his backpack. He came alone, invited back by Dr. Santoro to perform at the annual fall recital. It was her idea, a surprise solo act from a student of the summer arts program, a way to show what raw talent could become with the right support. Tiago had grown a few inches since spring. His jeans fit better. His curls were neater, and his hands had developed a quiet confidence. He still didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. The auditorium looked just as he remembered it. Clean floors, bright lights, that stage. It didn't feel bigger than him anymore. In the front row sat Professor Aurora, her purse balanced on her lap, eyes shining with quiet pride, and next to her, Vittoria, wearing her best blouse and clutching the edge of her seat, as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She hadn't been sure about the performance at first. "I don't know what people like that want from kids like you," she had said. Tiago had answered simply, "Just to listen." Now, here she was, waiting to hear. The MC gave a brief introduction. Tonight's final performer is a young man who reminds us why music still matters. Please welcome Tiago Reis. He walked out. Not too fast, not too slow, just steady. The Steinway was there again, waiting this time. He didn't hesitate. The piece he played was new, something he had written 2 weeks earlier, inspired by his summer. It had no title, just movement. It started low, steady, like steps being counted, then climbed, measure by measure, into something warmer, more certain. There were flourishes, yes, but nothing showy. Everything had purpose. Notes flowed like thoughts forming mid-sentence. Honest, true. Halfway through, he glanced up. Gabriel sat 3 rows back, arms folded, watching. They hadn't spoken since that hallway, but Tiago didn't need words. The silence between them now wasn't heavy. It was filled with understanding. When the final note hung in the air, Tiago held it just long enough for the breath in the room to catch. Then he lifted his hands, and this time the applause came fast. Not polite, not hesitant. Real. Vittoria stood up. She didn't clap at first, just stared at her son, as if she couldn't believe he was hers. Then quietly, she smiled. After the show, people approached him. Teachers, parents, a few students. They asked about his music, where he learned, what came next. He answered as best he could, still uncomfortable with too much attention. But one moment stayed with him most. A small boy, maybe 9, skinny with crooked glasses, walked up and whispered, "That made me want to try piano too." Tiago knelt slightly. "You should. I don't know how. Doesn't matter. Just start." The boy smiled. That was enough. Later, as they drove home, Vittoria was quiet. "You okay?" Tiago asked. She nodded. "I just never thought I'd see something like that. Not with your name on it." He looked out the window. The streetlights blurred past. "Neither did I," he said. "But maybe it was always there." She didn't answer, but her hand reached across the console and rested on his. That night, Tiago sat at home with a notebook in his lap. He wasn't writing music, just words, scattered thoughts, a line he wanted to remember. "You don't have to be invited to be allowed." The world hadn't given him permission to sit at that piano. He had taken it gently, honestly, fully, and in doing so, he had reminded them and himself that talent doesn't care where you come from, what you wear, or how much your parents donated. It only cares that you listen to it when it calls. So if you are watching this and wondering whether you are good enough, whether you are allowed to try, here's your sign. You are. Now go do it. And in that moment, the silence turned into awe. They laughed. They doubted. But they'll never forget what they heard in that room. If this story moved you, just imagine what else we have coming. Stories that inspire, lessons that transform, truths that surprise. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next video might be exactly what you need to hear today. And let me know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated? Your story could inspire someone here too.